We are COMP2068, and it's week 2, lesson 2, part 3. And in the last part, what we did was we did a small Create.js demo, and we used a little bit of TypeScript for those people who have access to that. But most of it was JavaScript, really. I mean, when you look at the TypeScript, the only piece of the TypeScript, and I was just doing a little demo with TeamViewer, the only piece of the TypeScript that we use that's not JavaScript is this piece, right? The piece after the colon, right? Because there is no typing in JavaScript. And this, of course, on this side, will be the JavaScript, the clean JavaScript that you would get from it. But this is all fine and good, right, as an example. But we did a couple things here, and as we were going, did it not seem apparent to you how JavaScript functions? It's very similar to, it's very C-like, right? Because JavaScript is just a C-influenced language, right? Which means there's a lot of things in JavaScript that you already know how to do. If you know C#, and you've had access to that, or Java, or C itself, Swift, Objective-C, C++, I can keep going. If you know any of those languages, PHP, it's very it's a C-influenced language. So you've done something on one, and you already know parts of this that you don't realize that you know. Okay? It's almost like you speak a language. An example would be you speak Italian, right? But you understand a little bit of Spanish, right? Because some of the words are the same, right? Or if you speak Greek like me, I can pick up some Slavic words, right? I understand things from Croatian and Bosnian and Russian and some Turkish words. Because you know what? There's a lot of influence, Turkish influence, in Greece, right? At the time when they invaded Greece. Now, I don't want to give you a history lesson, but the idea is the same, right? This all started way back when Ritchie created C, the C language, right? And everything else is C influenced. Almost everything we do these days, right? So if you know C, then this stuff is C influenced, the same kind of things. All you have to learn is the syntax, because realistically, every single programming language is fairly the same, right? And they have different capabilities. JavaScript has its issues, and we're going to talk about those now. All right, I'm going to put this up on GitHub as well. Sorry, on Blackboard, GitHub. GitHub's in my brain. So again, what we want to do is we have this. There's two ways of doing JavaScript, and one way is doing embedded JavaScript, where we embed JavaScript alongside HTML. And you might see a lot of examples online, especially the ones we just downloaded from Create.js, that show embedded JavaScript. So HTML, and inside the HTML document, there's no external document for JavaScript. It's one file, and it does it all. Bad. All right? It's great from a demonstration purposes perspective, but we don't want to use that in our code. We want to have good, structured, semantic HTML5 on one side, your JavaScript in another folder, and your CSS in another place. You don't want them embedded or inline CSS or inline JavaScript as much as possible. And this is the two examples. Here's the external file, and this JavaScript is the other way to do it within the header. And this stuff can appear within a script element, right, where you can do your JavaScript in here too. So you can actually do all the stuff we did inside your HTML document, but it's bad, right? It's bad because it makes the document unruly. It makes it huge, right? So imagine we're doing a full game, like I showed you Starbase 12 last week, right? Well, that was a full game with many, many, many different parts to it. Imagine if it was just one big, ugly document. You'd swim through it all. You wouldn't be able to get to it. So again, and this is another example of JavaScript in the body of your HTML document. So let's talk about statements really quickly. So JavaScript is case sensitive, right? It's not like VB. If you remember VB, VB is not case sensitive. You can make the same variable in VB, capitals, lowercase, camel case, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? That's not true with JavaScript, and it's not true with most more advanced C-influenced languages like C#, Swift, Objective-C, C++, and so on, Java, right? They're all case sensitive. It ignores white space, right, which is another thing that it does. And it ends with a semicolon. Last time I asked you guys, is it required that you need a semicolon? And some of you said yes, most of you said no. The thing is, you don't need a semicolon with JavaScript, but it's best practice to put one in, okay? Things that you normally would see in a regular code and other places, C influence language, right? As an example, works fine in JavaScript as well. And this is some rules here. I'm not going to go read the slide, but there's some rules on what white space is and how it breaks up the code. Okay. When we call identifiers to me are variables, right? But they're the names given to variables, functions, objects, properties, methods. And usually we use camel casing, where the first character is a small character, just like in Java, right? And the second word is a large or capitalized character, right? And that's camel casing. Upper camel case we use for classes, right? So if it's capital, the first letter is capital, right? And then see here some rules. Identifiers can only contain letters, numbers, underscore, and the $sign, all right? You can actually start an identifier in JavaScript with the $sign. But I'm asking you don't do that, because you might confuse it with jQuery, right? Because jQuery uses $sign to start off an identifier. So please don't use $sign. You can do it, but it doesn't mean you should. Identifiers can't start with a number, like most languages. Most languages, Java, Swift, C++, C#, blah, blah, blah. They can't start with a number, right? Same thing with JavaScript. They're all case sensitive, like we said. They can be of any length, but don't be crazy, all right? The longer you make it, the more unwieldy it becomes, and it's hard to work with it in a single line. And that's why we make these big statements. We make an alias for these big statements. We'll talk about aliases later. You can't use reserved words, right? And another thing is, try and avoid using global properties and methods as identifiers, because if you do that, it might cause an issue. Here's some examples of identifiers you've seen before, and I'm not going to read through all these, but you can see on the left here, there's two basic ways of doing it. This way, where you have camel case, and this way with an underscore. Please do one or the other. Don't mix them up. And you might see online that they do that. They have like camel case for some, and then they use some of this because someone slapped together code, right? They've taken some stuff from online. They've taken some underscores, variables with underscores, and some variables with in camel case, and they put it together in one little code because they were slapping things together to make it work, right? It's bad. It looks ugly, and it should really, in some ways, comment itself. Your variables, in some ways, should kind of describe what they do. They should be contextual. So we want to use contextual variable names. Here's some reserved words, and by the way, you can go up online. You don't have to remember these, but you can go up online and try and find out what the reserved words are. So abstract, Boolean, break, byte, case, all the regular things that you use for keywords, you cannot use with your variables. It would cause an error. Okay. When you call an object, where you're going to use the dot accessor method. So the dot, right? Once we use dot, anything after the dot is the method name or the property name. So you have your object, whatever it's called, or your namespace. And sometimes you need to use dot, so your namespace, dot your class, dot your method, dot your property, and you can keep going down. It's called object chaining, right? You can do that with JavaScript as well. Again, I recommend that you remember that, because what ends up happening is, if you notice the method name is camel case, so lowercase, and your object name probably should be all uppercase. Usually you're referring to it like the ticker class in Create.js, right? Here's some very common methods that we always use with a window object: an alert, a prompt, a print, a confirm. We're not going to use these things here. I want you to be aware of them because we're talking about JavaScript. And you might see that if you want to do a test, you can use an alert for a test. So if I go back to Visual Studio 2013, right? And if I say here, I want to start off my function here with an alert, program is starting. This is silly, by the way, and I don't recommend this, right? But if I do, and if I run it, it's going to pop up this ugly alert, right? Boom, program is starting, right? I don't recommend this at all. And I think the problem with using an alert is, and more often than not, it annoys the crap out of users, right? I don't want to see alerts popping up, so please don't use them in your code. You use them for debugging, but sometimes they can also cause a browser error, so be careful of that. The easier way to debug, again, if you're going to use an alert instead of an alert, is go to More Tools with a hamburger if you're using Google Chrome, and look at Developer Tools or JavaScript Console. And that can help us understand what's going on here, not your alert. Although sometimes we revert to that because it's easier for us to do that than look at the JavaScript console. Okay, so let's just get rid of this. That's what an alert does. And you might have seen that, or you may not have seen that before. So again, there's 2 or 3 different data types, primitive data types that exist in JavaScript, but these can be inferred. All right? So type inference is something that actually Swift, the new language by Apple, does as well. So when you declare a variable, you can declare it. In most languages, you say int, like in C#, and the type of the that's the type of the variable. That's the variable annotation, the type annotation or data type annotation, right? Same thing that you're doing with Java, except the other way around, right? You say the name of the variable and then the type, right? Both ways, whether you use Java, C#, Swift, or whatever, you talk about the data type. Here in JavaScript, some people would say the beauty of JavaScript is its flexibility, and I also see that as the ugliness of JavaScript. It's both things, right? Because it's loosely typed, so people go crazy because of that. They're like, oh, I'm a programmer, I hate loosely typed languages. And that's why we're using TypeScript, because TypeScript adds typing, syntactic sugar we're talking about, on top of the JavaScript. There's the Boolean type, which is true or false. But the number type is any number, decimals, integers, whatever, everything else. All numbers are the number type. Right? And the thing about JavaScript is it's so, even though it says floating point numbers, it's still the number type. Strings are another type of data type, and strings are also a collection type. It's almost like a simple and yet complex data type in JavaScript, because you can do methods on strings, right? The good thing about JavaScript is everything is an object, right? Even your integer, like your number, is still an object. You can still perform methods on your numbers, right? And some languages don't allow that. So that's the thing. So people love its flexibility, but they also condemn it because it's so unstructured, right? JavaScript uses prototyping instead of classic object-oriented programming, right? Let's talk about expressions really quickly. Again, this is a review. If you've ever done any kind of programming language before, this is like a crash course on how to do JavaScript, right? Like literally. And you can use this as a reference card. I'm not going to read every single slide because you've seen this kind of stuff before. You know how to do increment a variable by plus plus. I'm just going to ask this. What's the difference between plus plus and whatever the variable name is plus plus, or plus plus in the variable name? What's the difference? Yes?
If you put plus plus before, it adds beforehand, and if you put it after, it adds it after.
So it's either before, it increments, it's the increment order, right? Does it increment before you check it or after you check it? That's what it is, right? I recommend you stick to one or the other unless there's a reason why you're doing plus plus x instead of x plus plus. There must be a reason for it. You must want to do a certain effect. Otherwise, stick with x plus plus. Increment after. But if you notice, all these arithmetic operators and everything else you see here is like every other programming language you've seen that's C influenced, right? Especially the comparison operators like equals equals, and less than and greater than. All that stuff is the same. Okay. And again, if I was going to say, do you know lots of languages? I'm telling you, guys can program in almost any language. It's not the language, it's the syntax. Syntax, the nuances of the language is what you want to take on, right? And the reason why we want to try and do simplify things as much as possible, and that's why I've put all your JavaScript or TypeScript in its own file, is it's easier to look at that instead of mixing it up with HTML. It's ugly, right? Then you're like dealing with HTML markup plus JavaScript. You get some JavaScript code, and it's a mess, right? This way we're being more organized when we do our stuff. Here's some examples of variables and examples of how to use them, and what they end up being. As you can see, it's very, very standard stuff, right? So you can, again, declare a variable and not initialize it. You can declare a variable and initialize it on the same line. You can declare multiple variables in the same line, like this, and you can initialize some or none, and so on. You can use shortcuts to increase the value of a variable. So this would be subtotal is equal to subtotal plus 20, right? Plus equals to 20 is a shortcut, and so on. It's all the same stuff that you've seen over and over again, and I'm not going to dwell. Yep. Yep. Sales tax is equal to, oh, it should be 0.1. Sorry. So string and Boolean variables, same idea. String variables, you can use the plus operator to concatenate two strings together, right? In other languages, it's the dot operator, like in PHP, you use dots to concatenate strings, same idea. Actually, the plus operator also works with Swift, it also works with Java, it also works with many other languages, even C#, right? It concatenates or adds on two strings together, right? So that's the most common way we're going to add strings together. And here's a message as an example with an escape character, right? And so on. I'm not going to go too much into detail here because everything that you know probably about strings and how they work in languages work the same in JavaScript. Here's some common escape sequences. They're all C influenced, so they're exactly the same as in other languages, right? Again, you can use this as a reference card. There's a couple of cool methods that you need to know though, because remember, if you're getting input for JavaScript from the console, right, or you're getting input from some place, it's all string type input. You're not going to get an integer. So you need to use parse int or parse float to convert a string into an integer if you're taking in some kind of input. Like if you're creating an app and that's with some kind of form that you're getting input from the user, you've got to convert it. And when you start converting, that's where you get all these issues with JavaScript, right? Because you're converting a string into a number, and people forget to do that. And if you give the user the opportunity for them to enter whatever they want, they can crash your code, right? So you need to do some validation, and JavaScript is really good at that. You can use JavaScript to validate that it's the right kind of input. And we'll go into that later on. The other value or type is not a number. That's one thing you can also test for. You can test to see if a value is not a number, right? And nan, so capital N, lowercase a, and capital N, is something that's JavaScript centric, right? If I test if a number is not a number, right, I can see that the number's never been assigned, or it's not a number. Maybe it's a string value or something else. Conditional expressions, like I said, they look and feel exactly the same as any C-influenced language, right? Double equals means is it equal to, greater than or equal to, not equal to. This should be not a dash. It should be an equal to. I don't know why it turned out that way. And the same thing with logical operators for adding things together. So this is not, this is and this is or. You don't use, some languages require you to use the and keyword and the or keyword and so on. This is not that. You need these operators here, which is the exact same as, let's say, C#. Whereas VB requires and, right? And so on. And other languages require and or, right? We don't have that here. So this, again, we're talking syntax, all right? Conditional if statements. Now we're into if statements already. You've seen this stuff before, so you know how to do if statements. I'm not going to re-explain what if statements are, right? But the exact idea here is the same. You don't need to use curly braces to separate your code blocks, but I highly recommend it. It's good practice. So if I see an if statement without a code block, right, I will comment on it and say, please don't do this, it's ugly, right? Because it can lead to problems. So you want to have every if statement, even if it's a one-line condition underneath it, I want you to use a code block with curly braces, please. Okay. Same thing with while and do while loops. They're the exact same that you've seen before. What's the difference between a while loop and a do while loop? High level. Anybody? Yes. Thank you very much. So we did this. I keep asking these questions over and over again. I think I asked it last time in Java, right? But it's true. So a do while loop always runs one time. A while loop, you have to check your condition and then see if it passes, and then you run the loop, right? And why would I use a while or a do while loop as opposed to a for loop? What's a for loop good for? Yes, again. But you need to know the size of the loop. That's the thing. See, a for loop is a fixed length, right? You know how many times you're going to iterate. Whereas a while loop, you don't need to know ahead of time how many times to iterate. You're going to iterate until your condition stops being true, right? A do while loop, you'll iterate once, you'll go through the loop one time, and if your condition is false at the end, that's it, you break out of it, right? There's also a for each loop, right? Because you can also, in the latest version of JavaScript, if I start typing for each, you can also do that as well. And something that we didn't cover here, but if I go in here and I say, if I start typing, and this is where I'm using TypeScript is a little better. If I start typing for, For can be two different ways. I can go for in, because both for and in are both keywords, right? So I can say the for each loop in JavaScript is broken up. I can make a for loop like this, like we're a traditional way, like for var x is equal to 0, x is less than 30, x plus plus. You've seen this before with some kind of code block, right? Right? You can do that. But if I know the value of if I have an array that I created, let's just say, and I say for arrays or values in my array, right? Well, I can do that too, could I not? Now I have to define values as, you know, some kind of character or whatever. I have to define it somewhere else. But I could do that for how many values I have in my array. I can put this in brackets, and this is a for each loop, right? And then from there I can iterate. I just haven't defined values, right? So again, it's good to loop through that. What it does is it goes through each element of your collection. An array is a collection, a dictionary is a collection, those kind of things. We don't have real dictionaries in JavaScript, so to speak, but we have arrays, and arrays are really flexible. Okay. So again, syntactic sugar we talked about before for TypeScript. Functions and objects. Again, some of the most common things we do with JavaScript, which we're not going to do here because we're doing game development, is modifying or manipulating the DOM, the document object model, right? But we did do that today. We said get element by ID, and what I'm doing is I'm saying it's a selection method. I'm saying select the element that I'm looking at. So get this element by ID, get a reference to the element that I'm looking at, and then pull it into my JavaScript, which is what I really did, right? Once I pull it in, I can manipulate it, which is what I did with the canvas. I pulled it in, and I used the reference to the canvas to throw it into stage so I can redraw the stage over and over again, right? And again, these are some methods that you can use when you're using HTML to modify JavaScript, right? So you can use the date object. You can define the date object and stuff and so on. There are some methods for the string of a string object, like the index of a string, the substring, start and length of a string. Because a string is a complex object, even though it's a simple object as well in JavaScript, right? This is where people get crazy, right? Wait a minute, a string is a complex and is also a simple object, you know, a simple data type? Yes, it is. And the thing is, a string also has these methods. So you can do this, the string to lowercase. You can put a string to lower. You can put a string to upper. You can take a string and substring it, even though you just defined it 2 seconds ago as hello world, right? Whereas in other languages, you have to declare it as use the new keyword and say new string, which is, you know, the big complex data type. And here's some examples of date and strings. So here's a new date object. This should say date, not data. And then I'm saying, well, today is a date object that I've created, an instance of the date object, right? So today dot to date string, right? And then get full. It should say get full year. I don't know why it's all bad. I must have been sleeping last night when I was doing this, right? And alert today dot get data, right? So you can do all these different methods on the date object, and you get different results. Same thing with the string. I can go to upper, the length, the index of, a substring, all those kind of things you can do. They're just methods off of the string complex data type. I'm going to talk about the document object model a little later, but really what I want you to think about is it looks like this. Your HTML document is a series of nodes, right? And when you look at the HTML document, the highest level is the HTML tag itself, right? Actually, the doc type is first and then HTML, right? And then underneath that, you have two tags that kind of are on the same level, head tag and the body tag. And inside the head tag, you've got a title tag and maybe some text and maybe some meta tags inside the head tag. Those are different nodes, right? And the body tag, you have your H1 tag, maybe some forms, maybe some paragraphs, and these are all different nodes within the body tag. And let's say you look at a form, well, the form might have its children, right? A label, an input, span, a label, another input, and these are all on the same level, state known level. So that's the DOM, a good picture, example of a DOM for a web page, right? When we navigate the DOM, we want to go up and down nodes, and you can do that with JavaScript. We're not going to do a lot of that in this course, but you can, right? And actually, if anything, if I was going to do this kind of DOM manipulation, I would talk about jQuery with you because it does it in a shorthand. It does exactly the same thing that JavaScript does, but with only like a single command as opposed to 3 or 4 different chain commands. What I want you to think about is a function. This is one way of declaring a function down here, where you create a name for the function, you declare it. This is interesting the way this is done. So you say, I'm declaring the name variable name, which is equal to this function, and with a set of parameters. Now the problem here is that when people look at this, they're like, oh God, that's really ugly. It's JavaScript. I hate it, right? Why? Because what you're really doing here is you're saying this. If I was to eliminate this piece, everything back from the equals on backwards, and I just put function parameters, that's legal in JavaScript. You know what that is? It's called an anonymous function. And anonymous functions are the things that all students, when we learn JavaScript, don't understand. They're like, hold on a second. I can just say function and not even use a name and pass some parameters. Yes, you can. But that's not really good, right? What you want to do is do what we did today. Function main, and then in parentheses, parameters that are being passed. That's proper syntax. However, this syntax works too. And you might see some stuff online like this, right? And you're going to go, what the hell is that? Guys, it's nothing different than what we did. It's just the components are broken up. This is a function that's with decomposition. Function decomposition looks like this, where you have your variable name that's declared here, right? Your identifier for the function, and then the anonymous function call right here, right? You can actually do this, and you can consider this an alias, right? Which means my variable name is actually an alias for this anonymous function. On that, if I go back here to create.js, here's my create.js, and for example, I say create.js stage. I don't like to use create.js every single time. Create.js, create.js, create.js. I want to create an alias for all of my create.js stuff. What could I do? Well, I could do this. It's silly and it's ugly, and I don't recommend it, but you could. I could say C is equal to create.js. So now I can do this. I can go down in here. Once I have this in a global scope, right? Let's go down here in my main. I can say C dot ticker, right? All the stuff that create.js would have, C dot stage, right? Because I can create aliases for any one of my variables. That's why I wanted to do this with you first. I could have done it the other way. You might have said, hold on, he showed us a demo on how to do create.js. We didn't even talk about JavaScript, and we were doing JavaScript, right? But the reason why I want to do this is to show you that we know JavaScript. You know how to program in JavaScript. You've done JavaScript. It's just another language. It's called C# or Java or whatever. And now we just need to learn its nuances, the things that make JavaScript different than every other language. Okay? Okay. Let's go back. So that's one way of declaring a variable function. And you're going to see it this way. You can say var show year is equal to function. You can do it that way, right? And all I'm doing is I want you to look at this. An anonymous function with no parameters that doesn't have a return value, right? It's very clear. Or here's another one, var $, oh God. $, as the single, the name, an alias. I can use $, for the alias for my function. Please don't do this one. That would be bad. But you could, right? And you could do this as well with 2 parameters. I'm sending 2 parameters in, right, as an example. And here's another one. I'm just going to say I'm creating a variable that's equal to subtotal times tax rate. I'm assigning, right? Well, in some ways, when I use that equal sign, I'm creating an alias for whatever is on the other side of the equal sign. Think of it that way, right? That means anything, any object, any value, any literal. I'm creating an alias. Now my variables are not just variables with memory locations, they're also aliases. I can make them look at or point to something else. So this is what a function looks like in JavaScript. In TypeScript, I want to talk about that as well. One of the things that TypeScript has is return types, right? So this is a JavaScript function right now. Main is a pure JavaScript function. There's nothing different here. If you look at the JavaScript side, it's identical, right? Here's what main can do though. If you say, well, you know what, main has no return value. I can specify that main has a return value of void, right? Why would I do this? Why would I care? I don't have to, right? Well, again, if we want to use the full power of TypeScript, it's syntactic sugar. I'm going to keep saying it over and over again. On top of, it's almost like putting sugar on top of JavaScript, right? And when we do that, we're saying, I want to get the code hinting from, from JavaScript that I can't get, right? And so if I was ever going to try and make main equal to something else, or if I'm going to expect a return from main, right? It'll error out if I try and do that. Similarly, if I say, well, main returns a value, right? So main returns a value. So main returns a string value. I can do that too, right? And if I do that, now it's going to give me an error. It's going to say, hey, your function is declared on a non-void return type, but has no return expression. So in order for me to make this return expression valid somehow, I don't know why I would ever want to make main return value, but let's just say, I want to return, my string is going to say started, right? That's valid now because I'm returning a type. Now it's not going anywhere. It's going into the bit bucket in the sky because I'm not doing anything. I'm just returning a value, but I'm not. When I call main, I'm calling it up here, right? And if you notice, when I hover over it, Visual Studio 2013 says, hey, you're going to get a string value back, right? But I'm not doing it unless I, for example, do something like this. My string is equal to main. And that means that I'm expecting a value back from main that I could read, right, in my console. Make sense? So if I run this now, let's see. Let us see, my friend. It's there. Oh, yeah. So the idea here is that, I mean, you could, the beautiful thing about TypeScript is it allows you to make it harder for yourself to do your work, basically. It stops you from making errors because it's easy for us to forget a semicolon. It's easy for us to, to declare, in our mind, we want this function to have a reason for being, right? Because we're trying to solve a problem, right? And so we want to try and match up the function with the problem we're trying to solve. And that's how we normally do object-oriented programming. But in JavaScript, we don't have that capability. Well, TypeScript allows us to do that. Let me just erase all this because I don't need any of this stuff, right? Because I never want to return a function from main right now. That's not my intention. And it's going to error out for a second. And by the way, when I have this error, because I declared it as a string, if I try and run this now, right? Oh, it'll give me an error for sure. It'll run, right? But look what happens. I don't have anything. It's not working. Where's my hello world? Why? Because it does two things, right? It gives me an error down here, shows me the error down here. This is the error that TypeScript has given me. And in here, inside my JavaScript console, right here it is, it says, uncut type error, cannot read property X of undefined. And you don't know why. You're saying, how come? I didn't do anything wrong. Why? Because you forgot that this is expecting a string type character, a string output, because you've told it that it's expecting that, and it's erroring out, but you're still trying to run it, and it will run, but it won't run properly. All right, so I'll stop debugging there. But most likely on the JavaScript side, I'm just going to stop this now. On the JavaScript side, it runs anyway. So function examples, this is the way the functions work. You've seen them before in other languages. It's just a matter of seeing them again. And this is the better way. The better name is this function name. This is wrong, actually. So say function name. I don't know why I got all these weird characters. But this is the way it would work. Function name and parameters. The name function method is the method I prefer that you use. It's less confusing, right? And it works better than var, a name of the variable, equals to an anonymous function. You could do it that way, certainly, but I don't recommend it. And we talked about local and global variables today in global scope. for now, what I'd like you to do is when we use stage, the stage, and we use the canvas variables and other ones that I say these should be global, let's leave them like that. But eventually, we're going to try and solve that problem and take them away from the global scope by using object-oriented programming. We did event handlers, but this is the event handlers we're talking about here trigger an event that we're specifying. This is one way we could do it. So the object variable, whatever the event name is equal to the event handler. Another way of doing the same kind of thing is an alias for the event handler. This is another way of declaring it. And here's some common examples. Document.getElementById. Here's my submit button that I'm targeting, and I'm using the onClick method of the document, right? And the join list is the callback function. I don't recommend this at all. This is bad. You don't have to do it this way at all. You can use the click method of the document window for the submit button. And it's a little bit different. It'll look different than this. So the latest version of JavaScript allows you to do that. And sometimes what happens is, I did something funky too. I said, I didn't do window.onload is equal to the function, right? I did this in my index.html, which you might have seen. Onload is equal to init, right? This is one way we can kick off our program, right? We don't have to do it this way. We can actually take this init function and run it inside my code at the top somewhere, or if I really want to, and call my initialization function if I want to. You can also make it so that you can say when the window loads, window.onload, encapsulate everything with inside this anonymous function. So when the window loads, run everything, run my code, right? That's another way to do it without calling that onload piece inside the body tag. Okay? And I'll stop here. We've already done arrays, but we'll talk about arrays a little bit next time. I've got about another 20 slides of this one I'm not going to touch. I will, however, upload it to Blackboard for you so you can take a look. So again, what did we cover this time around? We covered, we did a demo with GitHub, collaboration with GitHub, which I think is important for you guys to figure out. We did a little demo with Create.js. And by the way, the files, like I said before, are up online on my GitHub account. So if you want to follow along with the YouTube videos and you couldn't make things work, try and make it work again. Try and create your boilerplate again on your own, which would be the homework for next week when we get together again. Try and do this boilerplate again. Try and create your Create.js file through my videos. Do it again and again a couple times. And explore the API, the EaselJS API, because all the documentation is online. Try some stuff out, right, that you've never tried before. And the other one is, we talked about basic JavaScript and what JavaScript syntax is, right? And the things that we already know about JavaScript that we didn't know we knew, right? I guarantee you, you could probably write pretty good JavaScript. The pieces where you're going to have trouble with is the prototypical JavaScript, your object-oriented JavaScript that's pure JavaScript and not TypeScript. Because it used prototyping, and you've never seen that syntax before, right? And it's going to mess you up. That's the pieces that are going to mess you up. You're going to look at it and go, this is JavaScript, but I don't know what prototype means, right? What it means is you're creating a class, right? You're making a blueprint, a prototype, right? But the way it does it is a little bit foreign for us, and that's why we use TypeScript to fix all that. Okay, so next week, we're going to do more of this. I'm going to explore a new API. I'm going to use Impress.js next week, and I'm going to give you your first assignment, which is the dragon, right? We're going to look at next week. It's going to be a game you're going to create for the assignment. Every assignment is going to be a game. We're not going to do anything else but, right? So that'll be your first game that's going to be due for a couple weeks from now, after a couple weeks from next week. And we'll talk about that all next week. Again, I'm available between 2 and 3 today.